this sounds simplistic, but it's important, is reaction. They realize that punching someone looks all right, but if you punch someone, the reaction to that punch is what sells it. So as much as you're choreographing the person punching or kicking, you've got to choreograph the person reacting to that punch or kick just as much.
Hi, today we'll be talking with Grady Hendrix, New York Times bestselling novelist, co-founder of the New York Asian Film Festival, co-founder of Subway Cinema. Today we'll be talking about Taiwanese Wuxia film. So let's start with Subway Cinema and how Subway Cinema got involved with the Taiwanese films in presenting them first in New York and now in Schenectady.
Yeah, so before we say anything, I'm Grady. That's Chris. We're the co-authors of These Fists Break Bricks, which is about how martial arts movies came to America, which is a much weirder and funkier story than you'd think, involving everything from the CIA to distributors using pipe bombs to kill their rivals to, kind of everything. But I'm originally from a group called Subway Cinema that's been around for 25 years now. We're a nonprofit down in New York. And we basically started back in 99, 2000. We were just a bunch of dudes who went to the Music Palace, which was one of the last Chinatown movie theaters in North America. And when it closed in 99, we were all kind of like, well, plenty of people are going to show art films but from Asia, but no one's going to show the movies we like, which are like romances and comedies and action movies. And so we just had no experience. We just threw our money in and started doing it and kind of learned as we went along. And one of our members, so we wound up running this big festival called the New York Asian Film Festival that's been up at Lincoln Center for like 16, 17 years now. We've brought over everyone from Jackie Chan to Choi Hark to John Woo and everyone in between. And one of our members, Goran, he is mostly an electrical engineer who works for telecom companies, but he really got passionately interested in working with film archives in places like Korea and Taiwan. So he's been going to the Taiwan Film Archive for years and really knows his way around there. And they've always wanted to do a program with us. And he put together one a few years ago called Taiwan Black Movies, which is about banned movies from Taiwan, which are sort of these pulp and exploitation movies that came out there that were really seedy and amazing. But then he put together this Wuxia retrospective, which is huge and overwhelming. And it's a lot of, there's some 35 millimeter in this, but it's also some 4K restorations that were done just for us that Goran helped get the funding for. There's some 4K restorations that were just floating around that no one was doing anything with. A lot of them have gotten new subtitles that he helped raise the funds for and got done. So this is Goran's baby, and we're just sort of the nanny, making sure as many people as possible see these movies, because they're kind of an amazing slice of film that just people don't see very often.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I mean, there's been some activity in the last few years with the King Hu movies finally getting really good-looking transfers and releases in the U.S. Two of them through Criterion, and then other companies also doing restorations. But some of the other lesser-known films, particularly two of them that were done during the break in A Touch of Zen, those are being shown as well. And I assume those are two of the films that you were talking about with the improved subtitles, because the versions I saw years ago had pretty bad subtitling.
Yeah. Well, let me see. I think because that would be A City Called Dragon and Grand Passion. And I think those ones, I'm pretty sure do have new subtitles. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they were filmed during the break in Touch of Zen. And I feel like before we go on, we should probably define what the hell we're talking about to people. You know what I mean? We keep saying wuxia because you and I, we know exactly what we mean. But I mean, how would you describe it in a sentence or less, Chris, to someone who doesn't know what these are?
Well, there's swordplay films, period pieces. Many of them have a heavy fantasy element. In the case of A Touch of Zen, there's hinting at supernatural.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of flying about and swordplay, and very leaning towards female heroines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
More often than not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would almost say that they're almost the equivalent of westerns, you know, in the sense that, they're action movies, they're set in the past, but they often sort of reflect on present times. And like you said, yeah, they're sort of the inverse. Like, whereas westerns sort of favor a kind of gritty realism and sort of macho dudes shooting
Mm-hmm.
each other, these lean a little more fantasy, because their swords people are so skilled that their skills they're too fast for the human eye. They're almost super powered because they're so good at killing people with their swords. And like you said, they focus more on women. And it's funny. I I feel like, so just like westerns kind of take place in this mythical Wild West that doesn't really, as gritty as they get, doesn't really have a lot to do with American history in the 19th century. It's kind of like it's got its own style, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the saloon and brothels and stagecoaches and gunslingers and cattle rustlers and these things that kind of have real world parallels, but they've almost become their own mythological language in this mythological country called the Wild West. Wuxia movies are the same thing, except their mythological world instead of the Wild West is called the Jianghu, and that means rivers and lakes. And that sort of stands in for this idea that these movies and these legends and these stories, because they appeared in folklore, they appeared in sort of classic Chinese texts, and then they appeared in pulp novels that were serialized in newspapers before they started getting turned into movies back in the 1920s. Um, the rivers and lakes, the Jianghu, this was the Wild West. This was neither here nor there. It wasn't a city. It wasn't, a town. It was the wilderness. It was where anything could happen. It was a land of taverns in the middle of nowhere and abandoned temples and forests and bamboo groves and secret caves where kung fu martial arts masters lived. And so it really does parallel the Wild West, except like you were just saying, way more women.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And you mentioned the connection to westerns, which I forgot about, but yeah, I mean, you could see it in the oldest of the films in this series, Dragon Inn,
Right.
which is kind of like 310 to Yuma. Really, it's a prisoner
Yeah.
transport story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's funny, like, to go to Dragon Inn. Oh, it's definitely a 310 to Yuma kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to go to Dragon Inn. So I think one question people might have is sort of, why should we care about these musty movies and or dusty movies? They're
Mm-hmm.
from the past. Who cares? But and we can talk about that later. But Dragon Inn is really almost ground zero for these movies because it's directed by King who to you and I is sort of like, well, yeah, it's King Hu. But he was a director like that some people may not know, and he was the equivalent of John Ford. Like, these movies existed beforehand. There were westerns before John Ford, but John Ford really turned them into something special. He made them respectable. And I think before John Ford westerns, they some were for kids and they were series and there were, all these things that they weren't considered, they couldn't be art. And John Ford sort of made them art by giving them a language, a cinematic language. And King Hu is much the same. He was his family were political refugees from mainland China, and they moved to Hong Kong. And King Hu really wanted to turn wuxia movies into art. He believed, and there were wuxia movies already. They were some of the first movies in China were wuxia movies, but they were fantasy films. They were considered sort of lowbrow, and he wanted to elevate them. And you look at them now and you think, well, these are martial arts movies. But at the time, that's because King Hu made that vocabulary of martial arts movies that has since gone on to influence everyone else. Um, and some of the innovations he brought to it was he sort of had this idea that the world was a stage. Everything was Peking opera, which is the very acrobatic form of Chinese opera that has been around for thousands of years or hundreds of years. And he had this idea that the screen is a stage. So he incorporated, instead of doing movies where they would just steal Western soundtracks from soundtrack albums as the score, or drop in some generic orchestral music, he really went back to Chinese opera and Chinese opera instruments. And he made sure every character was very distinct. They were almost iconic. You had these scholars who sort of wandered around in their silk robes with their fans in one hand, and suddenly they'd move really fast. They would quote classical poetry, and suddenly they move really fast, and a sword would be in their hand, and they, chop a fly in half or catch a teacup that was falling on the edge of the blade. And then there were his fighting women, who we can talk about in a minute, who were sort of almost feral. They were like ferocious women who just took on scores of dudes. There were the bad guys, who were sort of these cackling thugs. There was the eunuch, who were famously in China. They often worked as like government ministers and court aides and advisors, and they were castrated, of course, so they could move freely in the court without any risk that they might seduce a courtesan or one of the king's mistresses, or the queen or the empress. They had no sexual threat, and it was believed that by being castrated, the same as there's that sort of urban legend that if you go blind, your other senses improve to compensate. There was this belief that these guys were castrated, and so their martial arts power would increase to supernatural levels, and they could make their skin iron hard so it couldn't be penetrated by a blade, or they could break a sword with their bare hands, and they could fly. And these characters would all get these magnificent entrances, and King Hu would also sort of stage action in a really innovative way. He believed that, okay, all these swords people are supposed to be so good that they're basically wizards to some extent. It's the same as the gunfighter who can, shoot the wings off of a fly at 100 paces, or they draw their guns so fast that no one can beat them to the draw. These guys could harness their supernatural powers, or their swordsmanship, to fly, or they could catch arrows that were being shot at them, or move so fast you couldn't see them. And so King Hu had to come up with ways to portray this on screen in the 60s. So he would use jump cuts to do it. He would sometimes show someone moving from entering into the frame on one side, and then exiting so fast, or jump cutting so fast it seemed like they would disappear. Mm-hmm. They would use springboards or trampolines to leap incredible distances, and they would use wire work, which was in its really infant days, but which make these guys look like these men and women look like they could fly. And wire work was really complicated. I mean, it would take like 6 hours to set up one shot. And so King Hu also really wanted to infuse these movies, even though they may just look like martial arts movies. He wanted to bring in bigger themes. This idea that sometimes being, the government wasn't always your friend, that a lot of these heroes were outlaws living on the margins, and that there was a nobility in their commitment to to one another, to their commitment to their skills and their study of the martial arts, and their determination to do the right thing, which sounds simplistic, but he really wanted to elevate that. And you see it in his movies as they progress. I think Dragon Inn is a pretty straight up King Hu movie, but then you start getting to his movies, especially Touch of Zen, which we could talk about more, but that was sort of his magnum opus. And like you said, it took so long to film that the actors and technicians on it were going off and shooting other films that are in this series while they were still filming Dragon Inn. And it came out and was a flop, and really kind of wrecked King Hu's career, until suddenly 3 years later, the Cannes Film Festival screened it and gave it a special award, and it became this classic instantly, and everyone was immediately reevaluating it, and elevated King Hu to being like this genius master of these movies, when previously they'd sort of shunned him as box office poison. after Touch of Zen. And Touch of Zen goes to this point where these martial artists are all refining their abilities so much. They refine them past the point of being human. And in King Hu's Touch of Zen, he keeps that refinement going. He's like, well, what happens at the end point? And at the end point, you refine these abilities. You meditate, you focus, you learn to cut out the material world, and you hit a point where you transcend even violence. It was almost like a gunslinger who gets so good at what he does that the real world stops mattering to him. He's transcended this physical plane, and that's what he's shooting for in movies like Touch of Zen.
And what I find just fascinating about the production of his films is that he already knew what he wanted to do with A Touch of Zen while he was still filming Dragon Inn. So
Yeah.
he had that fort being constructed while he was wrapping up Dragon Inn, because he knew it would take like 9 months. Because it took 9 months to build that fort, and then also like the swamp water in order to get it looking swampy. They left it long enough for algae to to grow out there. Yeah, so he and the weeds to come, and just like for one shot with some of the flowers, I think he waited a whole year to get a second take because they wanted the flowers to come back into bloom, I think, or.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, that's one of the things that's really, I think context really helps, especially with King Hu. Because, like you're saying, you watch a movie that's 90 minutes long or 3 hours long. Well, you watch a lot of movies that are 90 minutes or 3 hours long that don't take this kind of care. And what you have to realize is, you watch Mission Impossible 8 or whatever they're on now, and you're like, okay, I've seen stunts like that before, but you've seen them done with CGI. You've seen them done digitally. You've seen them done because they've been influenced by movies like Mission Impossible. And it's the same with King Hu's films. You may say, oh, well, I saw Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Well, yeah, but that's using digital effects and a really sophisticated form of wire work. But it's also doing nothing more than honing and refining a sort of progress that King Hu started. And like you're saying, he took so much. He was creating these movies, a whole genre of film from scratch, a modern day mythology out of thin air. And so, like you said, 9 months to build one set, a year to reshoot something and get a second take, 6 hours for one quick shot. There's a scene in Touch of Zen. It's about a little under 10 minutes in a fight in a bamboo grove. They took them over a month to shoot. And so, you're seeing this stuff for the first time, and it's easy to take it for granted unless you know the context.
Yep. And, that bamboo fight scene, that's so influential. I mean, you've seen it redone and ripped off and homage paid to it.
Yeah.
Still.
I mean, I think if you're being highbrow, you call it an homage.
Right.
If you're being lowbrow, you call it a ripoff.
Yeah. I'll say both.
And the other thing is, the other thing I think it's easy to forget is he was making a new kind of film. And not only did he have to construct the language of that film from scratch, not only did he have to construct the costumes and the sets from scratch and the style of filmmaking from scratch, he had to construct his actors from scratch. I mean, you had these women like Polly Shang Quan or Shu Feng, who really they were just teenagers. They were just trainees. They were sort of no ones. And he took them, and that was sort of a trademark of King Hu. He'd take these nobodies and teach them how to act for months. He would give them months of acting lessons, months of martial arts training, months of Chinese opera training to make the kind of people who could make the films that he was making.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, that sequence in Dragon Inn, which you did a breakdown of it on the Criterion disc, where Polly Shang Quan storms the Dragon Inn with the arrows flying at her and the swordsmen coming at her and everything. I think that pretty much single-handedly launched her career because it was her first film. She had no acting, no martial arts training before she did that movie, and I think that sequence, whatever it is, 6 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever. Yeah, I mean, she had a career for 20 years after that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, I think one of the things is that it's you put the time into creating these movies, and I think some people really did think King Hu was crazy. To spend this much time and this much effort where he could have cut corners, but like you said, to spend months and months and months and months training an actor from scratch and to have this scene that really, I think that scene runs like 5 minutes, 6 minutes. But you're right, that forged her career because you can see and feel all those months of training in her when she's doing it. There wasn't anything like that on screen before. This determined, badass actress with this sort of like tunnel vision focus, and coupled with this sort of style of action filmmaking that was very innovative, that really highlight her strength and her speed and her abilities. Like, boom, instant star.
Yeah, and 10 years later, I think when somebody made Green Dragon Inn, which is very similar, rip off, homage, whatever. She's in that. She's also in. There was a Union production, I think, called The Girl Fighter, which is also a 3:10 to Yuma sort of prisoner transport story with Polly Shanquan, which is not being shown in the series, but it's from the same production company, Union Film.
Yeah. No, exactly, which was Taiwan's. I mean, and so let's talk about Taiwan for a minute, because Taiwanese wuxia was a real thing. Hong Kong was making wuxia movies, and in fact, the movie that sort of started this new trend in wuxia movies and was I mean, depending on who you're talking to, Shaw Brothers, which was the big mega Hong Kong studio that made all the movies with T. Lung and David Chang with the Five Deadly Venoms, really like the movies we think of when we think of martial arts movies. Shaw Brothers sort of had been making these movies before, but they were they weren't as ferocious as they became. The emphasis was on grace and elegance, and they were much more romantic. And then in 1967, there was this movie called One-Armed Swordsman, and it came out right after King Hu's Come Drink With Me. One-Armed Swordsman starred a dude. Come Drink With Me starred Chang Pei Pei, a woman. And so those two movies really launched this new wave of making wuxia movies more realistic, making them about the world, finding a new cinematic language to tell them with. But right after he made his second film with Shaw, Dragon Inn, and I actually think, didn't he go to Taiwan to make Dragon Inn?
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, after Come Drink With Me with Shaw Brothers, King Hu decamped to Taiwan to make Dragon Inn, the follow-up. And basically, Taiwan was a huge market for Hong Kong movies, and there was a lot of back and forth between Taiwan and Hong Kong. You could import Hong Kong movies to Taiwan without paying a duty on them, and the same in reverse. Also, the actors spoke roughly the same language, Mandarin in Taiwan or Taiwanese dialect, Cantonese in Hong Kong, but people could get by, and the faces became very familiar. Taiwanese actors would be in Hong Kong movies, Hong Kong actors would be in Taiwanese movies, and Taiwan had something Hong Kong didn't, which was a lot of outdoor space, mountains, bamboo groves, things they had to build in the studio in Hong Kong that they could just find. And it made Taiwan almost this exotic backdrop for a lot of these movies. And also, Taiwan had government sponsorship of a lot of their filmmaking, and Taiwan had a military, which had mandatory military service, where they taught martial arts. So you had a huge talent pool of people who knew martial arts who came out of the military relatively young, in their early 20s, who wanted to do something. You had Chinese opera schools there, the same as you had in Hong Kong. So there was a lot of back and forth, but the big difference was people felt like Hong Kong was run. There were many studios, but the biggest was Shaw Brothers. And Shaw Brothers, as great as it was a one-man show. Sir Run Run Shaw ran that place with his partner slash mistress, later wife, Mona Fong, and they controlled everything. Taiwan was viewed as much more free. There was a lot more movie studios, there was a lot more production companies. If you wanted to make movies outside Run Run Shaw's control, you went to Taiwan. And so you got a lot more innovation out of Taiwan and a lot of new talent coming from Taiwan.
Mm-hmm. Now, the Come Drink With Me was part of the Shaw Brothers, the new wave of action that the wuxia. I forgot the term that they had, but it was going to be
It was like it's like
wuxia explosion or the action I forgot the exact term that they had for it.
I can't remember exactly what they called it, but it was like the new color wuxia wave or something.
Offensive. I think maybe was it the offensive? The wuxia offensive, right? Which they wrote about in their magazine, Southern Screen,
right?
And but right up to that point, like they had done a swordplay film right before that called I think it was The Magnificent Trio was the title, and that was just like a knockoff of Three Outlaw Samurai, the Hideo Gosha movie. So which is. That's not wuxia really, but then you see it's a samurai knockoff really. But then you look at Come Drink With Me, and it's like a whole new thing, really. Yeah.
Well, exactly. Well, it's funny, Shaw Brothers, like you're saying, in the late '60s, they did this. Yes, and they were like, oh, this is our I think it was like the color wuxia offensive, like you were saying. And what's really funny is they put all this money and time into it. The first 3 movies in the offensive were total flops.
Mm-hmm.
The 4th was like shelved. The 5th was shelved. I think one of them was even in black and white instead of color because they ran out of money. And really only Come Drink With Me was a success because it was so new. And then right after Come Drink With Me, One Armed Swordsman was a big success. And One Armed Swordsman was a success, I think, because in part, as much as King Hu was making this new language, he had these new actresses. He had Cheng Pei Pei. One Armed Swordsman felt like almost a flip side of that. It was much bloodier. It was much more savage. And it had a guy, Jimmy Wang Yu, in the lead role instead of a woman. And instead of putting that emphasis on speed and technical elegance, it put the emphasis on blood and hacking off people's arms. But it came out at a time when that's what Hong Kong wanted, because that was a time when there was basically a strike at an artificial flower factory in Hong Kong, and the police broke it up with an enormous amount of unwarranted brutality. And the police in Hong Kong was a British colony, so the police were viewed as tools of the colonizers, and people took to the streets, and it resulted in a year-long series of riots, protests. Buildings were taken over and occupied. There was a bombing campaign in Hong Kong where I think 1,000 bomb threats were called in, and out of that 1,000, 300 of them turned out to be real bombs. People died. It was the Cultural Revolution was going on in mainland China. You had a bunch of Hong Kong cops were machine gunned on the border. I mean, it was a time when it really felt like Hong Kong, this was the end. Mm-hmm. It was the 60s all over the world, right? In France, in America, everywhere. It felt like this is the end. The young people are rising up, and leftists and socialists are rising up and fighting the system, and it's all over. And I think Come Drink With Me, to some extent, and One Armed Swordsman kind of captured the spirit of the time. But then the other movies that came after it, many of which are in this series, really captured the spirit of that time. I mean, it's hard to look at a movie like A City Called Dragon, which is like 1970, which is Xu Feng, who had a tiny part in Dragon Inn and stars in Touch of Zen, playing this kind of underground revolutionary. And the bad guys are all like the Manchus, the Qing dynasty. And so the government is the bad guys, and she's in this town where she represents a revolutionary cell and has to sort of live by her wits to help overthrow the government. And that became a very constant theme in a lot of these movies. The evil Manchus who ran China were a totalitarian government, the evil empire that was being opposed by all these heroic swordswomen and swordsmen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one that I saw for the first time 2 years ago at the
Yeah.
Taiwanese festival, and yeah, there's some great segments in that, and that was directed by the first AD, I believe, on Dragon Inn,
Yes.
and yeah, Larry too.
Well, they
Yeah.
just got sick of sitting around waiting for King Hu to finish making touches in, so they went off and made their own movie.
Yep. Yeah, and yeah, there's that great sequence in the jail where with the fish, with the delivery of the fish, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's everybody, like if you're in town, you're anywhere near Schenectady, you should definitely check these out on the big screen because
Yeah.
that's where they were meant to be seen.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, and just to jump into something really quickly, when you're talking, so one of the things that's interesting about these movies is as much as they are westerns, in the US, we had these John Ford westerns coming that established the myth of the Wild West. And in the 60s and 70s, you had all these revisionist westerns like Little Big Man with Dustin Hoffman and movies like that that challenged this mythology, the Anthony Mann westerns and things like that. With Wuxia movies, almost as soon as King Hu set the script in the late 60s, you had people a couple years later start to challenge it. And, in some of these movies, you have one of the things you see a lot is revenge, right? And that's the famous thing that we all remember from like black belt theater as kids, or the stereotype about martial arts movies. You killed my master, prepare to die. And with movies like The Swordsman of All Swordsmen, which I think is that 68 or 69?
68. Yep.
Yeah. Like almost right away, Joseph Kuo, who was a famous Taiwanese independent director who, he didn't work for a studio. He shot these movies on his own and then sold them. He made The Swordsman of All Swordsmen, which is immediately a movie, it's a young swordsman who's like, he's going to kill the people who murdered his parents. And almost immediately it all goes wrong. And Joseph Kuo very famously, made movies about people who engage on these quests for revenge. And in short order, they either discover, oh, wait, I'm a mass murderer now. Like I've killed so many people in this quest for revenge. I'm worse than the people I'm trying to take vengeance on. Or their quest for revenge would just go off the rails and take them into these weird directions where they're kind of like, well, maybe I don't want revenge anymore. Like, what's wrong with me? So almost right away, you had movies subverting the idea of wuxia movies that subverted wuxia movies.
Yeah, Kuo made like I think 26 movies before Swordsman, and they're all romantic films, either like straight romance or romantic comedies. But he always wanted to do like a sword film because a lot of the movies, or most of the movies that had been released in Taiwan, were Japanese movies because the Japanese were in charge until whenever 1945. So, but like overnight, he saw "Come Drink with Me," and that's what he wanted to do. Was a wuxia.
Yes. No, exactly. Like, Come Drink with Me. I mean, it's a bit like so many people saw something like 2001: A Space Odyssey, or or The Searchers, and we're like, or Citizen Kane, and we're like, I want to make movies. This electrifies me. It's so different from everything else out there. And that was King Hu, especially with Come Drink with Me and Dragon Inn. That inspired so many filmmakers.
Yeah, and then Swordsman of All Swordsmen was so successful that it inspired two sequels.
Yeah, are we showing? Is this showing? I know this is showing one of the sequels, Ghost Hill.
Ghost
is it
Hill.
showing the
Yep.
other?
Not the other one. No, the other one was shown I think online only.
Okay.
At the Metrograph. Bravest Revenge is that one.
Exactly.
And,
which uses the same character.
Right.
Yeah. And and it's funny, even though it's not part of this series. I mean, one of my favorite Joseph Kuo movies, King of Kings, which is not a Bible epic, as you would think, but it comes out, and it's not as polished as Swordsman of All Swordsmen, but it takes sort of the premise of this guy on a quest for revenge is like, how do you, is just slowly going insane as he realizes he's killing all these people because they have a similar name to the swordsman who killed his parents, but is never the right person. And he's just like, dripping with blood by the end of that movie. And it brings up kind of a point I wanted to jump in for people, because I think one thing that really throws audiences sometimes that aren't used to the conventions of wuxia is often you have these actresses like Shu Feng or Polly Shang Quan or even Chang Pei Pei. Michelle Yeoh does it as well, um, where it's clearly a female actor, but she dresses in men's clothing. And
Mm-hmm.
everyone on screen is just like, oh, you're a man. And they just treat her as a man. And even though it can be laughable sometimes, you're looking at someone like Michelle Yeoh and everyone's referring to her as he. Um, it's an interest. It leads to an interesting thing in these wuxia movies that I think is good to keep in mind when you're watching them, which is something that's true in the West and in Asia at the time. So there were no photo IDs, and I know that sounds stupid, but in the 18th 19th century in the West, or in the modern times in Asia, people were who they said they were if they were away from home.
Mm-hmm.
If you were in the court, well, the emperor knew who you were, his associates, everyone knew you by sight and by your name, and your name was very important, and the reputation behind that name was very important. If you were at home, your family knew who you were, the people you were dealt with every day knew who you were, as long as you were home. But like we said earlier, these movies take place in the Jianghu, the in between space, the road, the tavern, the abandoned temple, the forest. And in those places, how does anyone know who you are? You are who you say you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so things like your name, your reputation, saying, I'm the purple eternity blade, like that was, oh, we know who that is. We've heard stories about that guy. But it also led to, you were a woman, you could just put on men's clothes and say you're a man. Well, what's someone going to do to prove otherwise?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's one thing that's kind of a trope in this that's a little hard to get used to, but it's kind of leads to this interesting space where you are what you say you are. So therefore your name, your reputation, your honor become all important, but also you can assume other identities simply by changing your name or changing your outfit.
Mm-hmm. Right. And like the Western, it's the wanted poster is really
Yes.
that's the one visual, you know.
Yeah, no, and think of how many of these wuxia movies hinge on someone like seeing someone in a wanted poster and recognizing them, or painting a beard on it and being like, oh, that's them.
Right. And there are some westerns too where the women dress up as men or boys.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true.
so that's another comparison. What I found interesting about revisiting, or one of the things I found interesting revisiting these films, was the progression of the choreography, like
Oh, yeah.
between a touch of Zen and Fate of Lee Khan, where he changes the choreographers for the fighting because he's now at Golden Harvest.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's so I'm going to let you talk about
Okay.
Sammo, but so we always associate Asian movies and martial arts movies with action choreographers, right? There's people like who are stars and also choreographers like Jackie Chan, but then there are people who are martial arts stars like Jet Li who are very dependent on their action choreographer like Ho Yun. Yun Wu Ping does the action in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, but it's performed by people like Michelle Yeoh and Chow Yun Fat and Zhang Ziyi and Chang Pei Pei. So, but there was a time when King Hu came along. There really wasn't a job title like action choreographer or martial arts director.
Mm-hmm.
And he started working with someone who was very early on, became one of the earliest martial arts directors, which was Hang Ying-che. And Hang Ying-che was a guy who was working long before there was a title for what he was doing. He was a really skilled martial artist, and he was sometimes known as a snakehead, which was considered someone who led a group of people somewhere, and he was considered leading this group of martial artists into film. It's also used sometimes for people who would like coyotes, we would call them, who help smuggle people into other countries, human traffickers. But this was human trafficking martial artists onto film sets, and these guys, they would all get a day rate, not very much money, like 30, $40, and they came from an older generation, Hang Ying-che, and they had sort of learned martial arts growing up, And by making a bunch of sort of less expensive martial arts movies, they learned how to sort of show them off on screen. Like, what do you do on screen to make this look real or powerful? And some of the techniques they came up with, like we talked about before, wire work was an early technique. Showing people, on a springboard or a trampoline to make them look weightless. But one of the big techniques they had, and this sounds simplistic, but it's important, is reaction. They realized that punching someone, looks all right. But if you punch someone, the reaction to that punch is what sells it. So as much as you're choreographing the person punching or kicking, you've got to choreograph the person reacting to that punch or kick just as much. And they would put them on wires and yank them to make them look like they're flying back a long distance. They would put powder on them so this puff of dust would come up when they were hit. And this was really interesting stuff, and it sort of formed the base work of action choreography. But then, Chris, take it from here, because then someone came along who built on that, who worked with King Hu.
Right. At Golden Harvest, Sammo Hung was starting to make a name for himself as a choreographer with the year before with a couple of Angela Mao movies. And Angela Mao is in The Fate of Li Khan in a supporting role, and she's one of the 4 waitresses that have been brought in. So when King Hu was at Golden Harvest making 2 movies back to back, but The Fate of Li Khan being the first one, it's most of that movie is set in an inn, in a tavern, and that was really what Sammo Hung's specialty was at that time, was fights within confined spaces, and you see a lot of what he had done in the Angela Mao movies, but right before that, with like fights over tables and on tabletops and using benches in the fights.
More props,
right? Yeah. That was another strength of his, was incorporating like whatever was around, pots and pans and so on, and also you saw some of the actors who were coming up in the King Hu movies were now working for Golden Harvest at that point, because Golden Harvest was still a new company. It had
and it
just
sort of
2
formed
years
in Hong Kong, just so people know what we were talking about. As a rival, it was people who were tired of. They worked at Shaw Brothers, and they were getting tired of the bureaucracy. They were getting tired of their sort of. They wanted to try new things, and Run Shaw was like, the old things work fine. And so they split off and formed Golden Harvest, and immediately signed some people like Sammo Hung, Bruce Lee, the Hui brothers, who were big comedians, and started turning out much more modern, much more innovative movies that became huge hits.
Right. Yeah, Bai Ying was making
and
Angela Mao movies probably in between the shooting,
exactly.
right, of A Touch of Zen. And so you have really the shift. The shift can be seen in The Fate of Li Khan, which is being shown in this series. The shift away from wuxia and swordplay to kung fu, to empty hand combat. There's more of that in The Fate of Li Khan than the previous King Hu movies, which were wuxia swordplay films, because Golden Harvest was getting away from that at that time. And and Sammo Hung's strength really was that. Even though in the Valiant ones, there's all sorts of martial arts on display in that, because then you have Yuen Biao is in that, and Simon Yun, and Yuen Hua shows up in that. A lot of the players who would follow Sammo Hung through the 70s show up in that movie.
Well, and Sammo Hung really did. I think you're right. I mean, he moved faster. The choreography got more intricate. He was working with a good stunt team that had a lot of acrobatic training. He also really sold power. He really focused on the reaction to blows and things. So suddenly, and people spitting up blood and stuff. So suddenly things seemed to get much more modern, almost overnight.
Right. Yeah, that's true. You start seeing people flying back. Again, it's a type of wire work where you're pulling somebody back as a reaction to a blow, where they fly back 20 feet.
Yeah.
and hit something. Whereas if you go and you look at Dragon Inn, I mean, one of the most iconic moments I think in Dragon Inn is when I think it's Shihan who catches the dart with the cup and then
Yeah.
whacks it and it goes through the rice paper and kills somebody. You just see blood hit the rice paper. That's a Japanese
Yeah.
technique usually, and then within a few years you're seeing more Hong Kong, a more Hong Kong Taiwanese style with the wire work really, which
Yeah.
you didn't see so much, if at all, at that point in Japanese movies. Maybe ninja
Right.
movies, but other than that, no.
Yeah. And okay, so we're sort of wrapping up momentarily, but what would be, I'll do three, but I want to hear your three. What would be your three kind of, someone's going to just see 3 out of these 10. What would you recommend?
I'd say Dragon Inn because that's the one that really started everything in Taiwan with the Wuxia films, and it was King Hu's hit. It was a big hit, and it was the start of a few careers, like we mentioned, Shi-hun
Oh, yeah.
and Polly Shan-kwan, and then Touch of Zen, just because it exists. It's here. It's 3-hour version, because I mean there's a whole history behind it that we're not going to get into about the release of it. It was released, in 2 parts, and nobody showed up for the second part, and then it was released for like 1 week in Hong Kong in a truncated version. So just to be able to see it on a big screen fully.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would actually say Touch of Zen, it's good to think of it as Sergio Leone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Like it's the Wuxia movie blown up into an epic. It's bigger in every sense. It's longer, the scope is bigger, and it has more to say. So I really always think of it as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of Wuxia movies.
Yep. And the third one, Ghost Hill.
Oh, really? Okay. Tell me why Ghost Hill, because I like the movie, but that's an interesting choice.
Yeah, I really like it, and it is the second sequel to Swordsman of All Swordsmen, but it's just crazy. I mean, just the set design. I mean, that there are all sorts of it's a castle that's pretty much hell. I think it's called Hell Castle, and the villain is a real satanic character. King Gold, I think, is his name.
Yeah,
and he's painted gold, and it's really the supernatural aspect of it, about him bathing in boiling oil, and you have that chamber with all the poisonous plants, all like the man-eating plants, and it's just crazy. It's like a Wuxia Batman. Yeah, psychedelic.
Psychedelic is, I think, how people call it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think the essay that was written for the New York show described it as a Wuxia crossed with television Batman.
Yeah, that's as good a description as any I've ever heard.
What are
so
yours?
my 3 picks would be, you got to have a King Hu in there, and I would actually suggest the Valiant ones. It came out a little later, and it sometimes gets overlooked. But the Valiant ones, I think it's such a great collaboration between Sammo Hung and King Hu. Like, they're really playing to each other's strengths for the first time. Like, Sammo Hung is clearly excited to be working with a director who takes this kind of care with his films. And King Hu is clearly excited to be working with an action choreographer from start to finish who wants to do something new the same way he does. And you could see them inspiring each other. And it really is a movie that is wall-to-wall action. The plot is just, there's a gang of Japanese pirates, they're raiding the coast, and the government hires basically some mercenary fighters to go not beat them down, to save the shipping industry from these Japanese pirates. And it is every variation on a fight scene you can think of, with these guys sort of at their best doing something really new. The second one I would go for is And I hate not to give love to Swordsman of All Swordsmen because it is a fantastic movie. And it's also 85 minutes long. So it moves like the wind. But the other one I'm going to give credit to is City Called Dragon. Sometimes I feel like martial arts movies can get a little unfocused and feel a little episodic. This happened. Oh, and then this happened. And then this happened. City Called Dragon is tense and relentless and all set in one city as I think it's Xu Feng is the star, and she's really ferocious in this. And she sort of invades the city to get the MacGuffin, get these plans so they can overthrow the government. And the whole thing is just nonstop betrayal, sneaking around, fight scenes. It's a spy movie given a wuxia backdrop. It's like a French resistance movie almost, with these guys fighting the Nazis in Nazi-occupied Paris, except it's Xu Feng fighting the Manchus government in a Manchu-occupied city in a wuxia movie. And then the third one I would go to is a modern movie. And as much as I appreciate Hou Xiaoxian's The Assassin, which is a real deconstruction of these films, which is it's one of my two favorite Hou Xiaoxian movies, I got to go for Reign of Assassins because it's sort of co-directed by John Woo and a writer turned director named Su Chao Bin. And it is a throwback. The Assassin is a very serious art film version of a wuxia. Reign of Assassins is a color comic book nonstop pulp version of a wuxia movie with a little more heart to it than you're used to seeing. It's got Michelle Yeoh in the central role, and she basically plays an assassin who she's like one of Joseph Quo's assassins or vengeance seekers in like Swordsman of All Swordsmen, who get sick of what they're doing and sort of what, the violence they're causing, and decides it's not righteous anymore. And so she walks away and she goes into hiding as a normal person. And years later, her old sort of fighting swordsman buddies find her, and they're all like almost like super villains. Like Chris is saying about Ghost Hill, these are sort of a more grounded version of the characters in Ghost Hill with like, these supernatural powers and these colorful costumes and names. But John Woo and Su Chao Bin give it this sort of grounded realism to keep it from flying too far off into space. So it's a bit like, I always think of it as like Batman Forever, in that it's a really grounded, pulpy comic book movie with a really amazing female performance at the center.
Yeah. And I should say, all of these are really good. A few of them are great. And you can see as many as you can see while they're being screened, and all the screenings are free. So, check them out.
You said it, took words right out of my mouth. And just to say, it's hard to leave your house. I get it. I have a hard time leaving my house. But like Westerns are best seen on the big screen, so you can appreciate the epic scale and scope. Wuxia movies are best seen on the big screen, where you really get a sense of how epic, how massive, how huge these movies are, and all that action choreography, all the care and detail people like King Hu put into it really gets sold to you.
This is great. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm always happy to talk about martial arts movies with you. We did a whole book about it.
Right.
I can't get enough. I can't quit you, Chris.
The book comes out July 8th. These Fists Break Bricks: How Kung Fu Movies Swept America and Changed the World.
Reel 1 was recorded at Open Stage Media Studios, directed and edited by Zeb Schmidt, and produced by Paul Kazee.